most people alive today, the events before and after December 7th, 1941 are blurred by the whirlwind of succeeding events in daily life. And in an abbreviated way, I will recreate the events leading up to the fall of 1941 when the attack occurred to encourage you to read books that go into greater depth. In my life, I've never experienced anything that has shaped my view and understanding of the world as so much as Pearl Harbor in World War II. The assassination of Kennedy, the men landing on the moon, 9/11, come close, but never come right to how it affected me. I was nearly 5 years old, and I was the youngest male in the family with a lot of other male cousins. They went to the war. Some volunteered, some were they had to go because they were inducted or received the call from the draft board. They came back with stories. One cousin came back with 2 Bronze Stars. One cousin didn't come back because his remains and his crewmates' remains were never found. My brother, he went and joined the Navy. He was a coxswain and on the landing crafts at Iwo Jima. So the war was a big thing to me. That's where I come from. I've asked 3 of our other docents who were around at the time to talk about their events at that time because they were older than me. I'm going to ask Bill Nelson to speak about it because he has an event he has to go first. So Bill?
Shall I go?
No, go ahead.
Well, I remember the Pearl Harbor Day in a strange way. I was 8 years old, 1 month and 6 days short of becoming 9. Strangely enough, I'm 1 month and 6 days short of becoming 92. And it all works out. But I had gotten a bicycle recently, and that was a big thing for me. And so I used to go riding around the neighborhood. I lived in San Fernando. Well, that day I was riding my bicycle through a vacant lot on a little trail that we had, and I saw a kid that I knew coming the other way. And he yelled at me, "Did you hear? The Japs bombed Pearl Harbor!" And I didn't really kind of know what was going on, so I turned my bike around and went back home and told him about it. We turned on the radio and we heard the story. And this was about noon on December 7th. Well, Southern California really was affected by that attack because they were very afraid they were going to be attacked. They had block wardens. They put up sirens all around the area. They ran air raid drills at night, and they'd come around and look at your windows to see if light was peeking through. They had elevated kind of platforms where people spent the whole day looking for airplanes coming. And I knew some people that lived in O'Neill's, which is a very small community in the foothills east of Fresno, and they had a platform up there where they looked for airplanes coming. So it was really serious, and I think it was Southern California, not so much up here. But I remember the air raids. I remember you couldn't find candy if you were a kid, and we'd ride around to various stores, and once in a while one of them would get some. I remember food rationing, ration stamps. Of course, they had gasoline rationing too, but I didn't know much about that. But the whole community was involved. My mother went to work for Lockheed Burbank. She was working on B-17 bombers. And we lived at that time in North Hollywood, just a little closer to where the plant was. They put up a camouflage net over that entire plant that made it look like a community. It's an amazing thing. It must have been 50 acres or something like that. And out around the area there were anti-aircraft gun positions and a bunch of bored soldiers, if you can imagine. And the kids would go out and talk to them, and they'd show us the 50 caliber rounds and things like that. So we really felt like we were part of the war, even though we weren't. But my mother was. She she was always proud of that. And later on, she saw the construction for some jet aircraft, which she thought was very shoddy because it wasn't nearly as well done as the B-17s were. So that was my memory, and it's something that's part of my life. I remember the end of the war, because by then I lived in the Bay Area, and they had a false alarm. I think it was a day before the actual surrender, and all the ships in the bay had their whistles going. It was really something to hear. And a day or two later, the real one happened, and everybody was very happy. So that's, in a nutshell, what I remember right now.
Thank you, Bill. Dale, you're convenient. Why don't you speak up?
You're convenient. It's interesting hearing these younger guys and me talk about that. Bill was talking about he was close to being 8 or 9. When December 7th hit, I was 1 month shy of being 12. Right now I'm 1 month shy of being 95. But I'm still vertical, and that's a thumbs up. I was a native of the Bay Area. I was born in Berkeley, brought up in San Leandro, and that's when I heard it. I was in the 5th grade at the time. Sometime in the morning, Sunday morning, I must have come back from church, and my mom had been listening to the radio and informed me that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor? Where in the hell is that? You know, I wasn't quite used to that type of geography. I went to see a friend of mine who lived 3 doors down. I told him, his mother overheard it and started sobbing. Oh, my sons, because she had 3 older sons. Sure enough, one of them got killed in World War II. The day following Pearl Harbor, on Monday, I went to school, Roosevelt Elementary School in San Leandro, and the teachers all let us out, sent us home to our parents. Not knowing too much, the guys that I hung around with, we were playing in the street, and guess what we were doing? We were looking to the west to see if we'd see any Japanese bombers coming in. That's how naive we were. My dad, who was a coach and teacher at Fremont High School in Oakland, he was 39 years old. Due to his age and his profession, he was exempt from a draft. But instead of being in the service, like Bill was talking about the block wardens, my father was a head of the block wardens in his area, checking to see that the blackout curtains were there every night. One of my dad's favorite students, my dad was a baseball coach, and the student manager he had was of Japanese descent. My dad really liked him. And lo and behold, a month or so later, he and his family were sent down to the internment camps. For those of you who have not been here on the ship, we have a great display over the fantail of the 442nd. I really encourage you to take time to see on that. It's an outstanding display. One of the things that you may not know, but the big beacon on Mount Diablo It was shut off shortly thereafter because we did not want the Japanese honing in on the Bay Area by seeing that searchlight. An interesting note is that the light for the beacon was made in Japan. That's something people don't know. One other thing, let me emphasize, things have changed so much from 83 years ago to here. For example, you never see kids walk into school anymore. Their parents are escorting them. My parents never escorted me to school. And that's how it is. There are other strange things, but we have to accommodate how there has been a change. For example, we had no TV, no GPS satellites, no cell phones, but we survived. And thank God we're still here. That's it.
Thank you. Paul? And Paul, please keep your remarks in English, not Italian.
I was going to talk in Navy talk. That's a third language skill that I have. Anyhow, appreciate the chance to talk. I am the youngest of the old geezers group, just recently elected into that egregious select company there. So I was 7 years old when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and I was just going into the second, or just starting the second grade. And I can remember the day because we were in church, came home from church. All the neighbors were out on the lawn, excited. And so we stopped the car, walked over to them and said, "What's happening?" And they explained to us that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. And of course, as a kid, I was very concerned about that. But my dad reassured me fairly quickly that the Japanese were not going to bomb Chicago. That's where we lived, in a suburb of Chicago. And I really needed to worry about that. So based on his reassurances, I just went on kind of being a kid. And lived the kid life for the next 4 years during the war, doing the usual things. Going to school and going to church, and Scouts, I think, was involved, piano lessons, and playing football or something, or baseball out in the side lot down the street. But I was aware of what was going on in the broader world, or the world of my parents. For example, there was rationing, was that mentioned? We had gasoline rationing. We were entitled to 3 gallons of gas per week for our car. It sounded like a lot, and it wasn't. Back in those days, cars didn't get many miles on a gallon either. So that was enough for my dad to get to work and back every day, and my mom maybe to go shopping once a week. But it didn't allow us to take our annual summer trip to Lake Erie, a cabin of my grandmother on Lake Erie near Cleveland. That was a disappointment to me. There was rationing for food. About a third of everything in the grocery store was rationed. You had to have a ration card in order to buy it. Things like sugar and coffee and meats in particular were in short supply. But we didn't really, we worked around that, and it wasn't really a big problem. We were doing our part to support the troops. So we had a victory garden. We were encouraged to do that. That was part of being a patriotic citizen. We bought war bonds. That was another part of it. And so on.
Awesome.
The war came to an end 4 years later, and my 6 uncles who had gone to war, 5 of them came back, 1 of them didn't, unfortunately. And that was kind of the end of the war for me. But my final chapter in my recollection of Pearl Harbor of December 7th occurred 12 years after the war was over, when, as a newly groomed ensign in the USS Navy, I took off in my aircraft carrier, which was called the USS Kearsarge, a sister ship of the Hornet here, built from the same blueprints. And we headed toward the Western Pacific, but we did lay over in Hawaii on the way over to replenish. And of course, we passed the Arizona Museum, the Arizona Memorial on the way in. We manned the deck. For those of you not familiar with that, everybody in their uniform gets up on the deck and aligns the perimeter of the deck. And as we went slowly past the memorial, we saluted the flag, which is flying proudly above the memorial there. But there are 900 sailors down below and trapped below that. That's their final resting place. So that was a stark reminder for me of what went on December 7th, 1941. As President Roosevelt said, a day which will live in infamy. Right? Thanks.
Thank you, Paul.
What suburb? Excuse me. What suburb of Chicago?
LaGrange, Illinois.
Okay.
Close in suburb.
All of them have mentioned about rationing. It reminded me of something too. Because of that rationing, especially the gas rationing, my father would walk to work or get in a carpool to save money. We lived in Tucson, Arizona, which was 60 miles from Nogales in the Mexican border, so that once a month we could go to Mexico and buy those things that were rationed.
Oh, no kidding.
But crossing the border back, the customs would only allow you so much per person. So that meant all four of us had getting 6 of us in a little Ford. It was crowded. I was a little kid, you can imagine. My older brother, who hadn't gone to the Navy yet, I was a pest. He wanted me to sit down, shut up. But at least I was one of the other 6 counts so we could get more sugar. Passing the German war prison camps that were between Tucson and the border. So these are memories and things of the war. I still have the coupon books that weren't finished. Yeah, and I had a bond book and all.
War bonds.
War bonds, yes.
Stamps.
Yes, stamps. Mine wasn't completely filled by the time the war ended, but I did it too.
Denominated way down to just 25 cents a stamp to encourage kids to buy them.
Yeah. 25 cents was a big lot of money. Whew. And I'll tell you something else. It's folks of you who weren't around at that time. We had another piece of currency that wasn't metal. Remember, it was made out of what?
Silver penny.
No, even less.
Zinc or something.
No, it was like it's like a plastic or something. You know, remember them being a magenta color.
They're called mills. They were red and green.
Thank you.
Right.
You were around.
Mill and 5 mills.
Yeah, you were around. They were in mills. True.
That was 2
You were precocious. Anyway, here we go. Why did Japan attack? It comes right down to a simple matter. Japan is an archipelago lacking resources. They have coal, but they don't have iron ore, oil, or rubber, and they needed them. So in their growing economy or industry, Japan in the early 30s, 31, initially was to militarily move across the Sea of Japan, and they went into China. They took over Mongolia. This is 1931. And then over those next about 9 years, they got more aggressive, feeling more empowered. And finally, their solution was to militarily push out. And what they did is, I think we jumped a slide there, but let me back up one, because I want to make a point here. They pushed out militarily, and they went aggressively into Japan in July of 1937. What really upset everybody is everybody knows there was the famous rape of Nanjing. And there was horrible pictures of this in magazines and all, with brutal acts by the Japanese. It incensed Roosevelt. And so what Roosevelt did is that because the Japanese solution was to move out so strongly militarily, he ordered the fleet in 1940 to Hawaii to deter any more of those kind of actions. It didn't seem to work, and so early in 1941, the United States and Japan began negotiations to see if they could settle this down and put it away. But in July of 41, the Japanese, emboldened by the tripartite pact, which later became known as the Axis power between Germany and Italy, and also by the fact that Hitler in June of 40 had also managed to conquer France. And so they got really kind of pushy, and they went down into what we called at the time in southern French Indochina. Guess what that name is today in our name? Worse, Vietnam. Went for the rubber. Now, FDR responded to that by putting an embargo on them. And the things that he embargoed, he put their assets, he imposed an economic sanctions, and he imposed an oil embargo. And this is where things started to really rub with the Japanese. Because without American oil, the Japanese military would come to a halt. In some of my research on another subject, I managed to come across a report that the British had on how much the Japanese had right down to the last cup of all the products off a distillate. And it's amazing. By the way, the British were probably the best in intelligence at the outbreak of the war. The only people who matched them were the Russians. It's unbelievable. We were kind of kids, and they say, if you read about this, they say the ones who were really the funniest were the Germans. They seemed to line up all their stuff like they were reading a Hollywood script. But it was the English and the Russians who were really on top of intelligence. And I've seen that report that the British had. They knew how much oil, and they, of course, shared that with us. Now, FDR and his advisors knew that when they put an embargo on the Japanese for oil, they were risking a war. They knew that. And by the way, they so knew that. In reading Secretary of War Stimson's diary 10 days before Pearl Harbor, he writes in his daily diary, the president has said the Japanese will probably attack in a surprise attack. He didn't think it was going to be Pearl Harbor. So they were aware of this. They were expecting it, but they expected it somewhere else. So the Japanese leaders were faced with a choice: end their aggression or confront the U.S. At the same time, the Japanese government, early in 1941, while continuing these negotiations, prepared for war if the talks failed. And they put that task on this man, Admiral Yamamoto. Yamamoto was a fan of America. He had traveled in the United States, went to school at Harvard. By the way, he spoke English fluently, and he thought it wasn't a good idea. But being a team player, he said, if we're going to do it, we have to do it effectively, because he said the idea would be to so shock the Americans that they would come to the table and negotiate. And why the Japanese would think that, that's the way they settled things with Russia just 50 years before in the Russo-Japanese War in Port Arthur. So at the time, another thing that's not known or recognized, domestically Japan was not as stable politically. They had gone through about 3 or 4 governments. There were assassinations, there were coups, and so finally on October 1st, 1941, they finally settled on this man to lead the government. And he's a general in the Japanese army. His name is Tojo. We used to make fun of him, along with Hitler. What it says, when the Führer says, we are the royal race, we howled. It was a song we sang as kids, and included, he nailed Tojo too. Anyway, the objective of the war, in part of the Japanese, was to buy time. Buy time and extend control over more of Southeast Asia, forcing the U.S. to the negotiating table. And the execution of the plan was going to be the following. They had already set their naval forces up on November the 26th up here in the northern islands of Japan, and they set them to sea with the idea if they didn't have, they would make a decision that further down as they were traveling towards Hawaii, that they would give them the word whether to go or not. On December 1st, the admiral who was in charge of the fleet, Nagamo, he got the word, proceed. The talks continued, and of course, here was the target. It was going to be Oahu. The fleet landed 230 miles north of Oahu. This is the way Pearl Harbor looked at the time. In fact, that picture was taken 30 days before Pearl Harbor. Yes, sir.
So at this time, had the Japanese already sent their declaration of war and their statement was true that it just hadn't arrived yet, or did they send it after the attack had ended?
They were in the middle of talking with Secretary Hull, who was our Secretary of State, two ambassadors, Japanese, at the time. It was all in the mill. But they knew what was going on, because you'll hear a little more what happens. But this is looking west. Here's the channel out to sea at Pearl Harbor. This is Ford Island. It's an airport. This is the Arizona. And these are the anchored points around the island. And the attack in this direction. It was 7:48 Hawaiian time. I make a point about that because Hawaii didn't line up at like the other places directly on the hour. They were 30 minutes off. It was 7:48 Hawaiian time, so look at this. Tokyo, 3:18. Washington, 1:18 p.m. So 353 Japanese aircraft attacked the U.S. base in the anchorage at Pearl Harbor. Here are pictures of those planes preparing for the launch. This, they think, was actually the second launch. Strangely, that picture was found in Attu, where the Japanese had a camp. Here's one of the Zeros. That's a Zero taking off. And to give you a better picture of what a Zero looked like, this is a restored one. It's really a very slick little airplane, lightly armored, and it ate our lunch early in the war. It was very fast, nimble. They had no armament. The pilots didn't want it. It was their choice. Here's a picture of the first part of the attack, taken by a Japanese scout plane. Yes, sir?
What made the Zero so remarkably good towards the beginning of the Second World War, and why did that change?
Because their airplanes were lighter, they could go faster, they could maneuver quicker. And that's the whole point in it.
Bulletproof tanks, and they didn't have armor.
Yes. So, do you want to say that louder so he could hear you?
They didn't have bulletproof gas tanks, and they didn't have armor plating, so they're very light. But 1 or 2 rounds would knock them down.
No, but like, again, I knew that they were built light. So America did try that too, but it still was faster than the one that America built.
Bigger engines at time, but that only lasted a short time. We only had the Wildcat. Soon we show up, the Hellcat looked very similar, and it surprised the Japanese. They didn't realize it was a bigger, faster airplane, and quickly the tide changed with respect to that. They had a bigger engine, and we could shoot them. This is one of the early attacks at Ford. Now we're looking east. You can see the pass there, and can you see the 2 airplanes in the picture here? Here's one. Here's another one. Just dropped a torpedo. Let me give you a closer look. See them now? Okay, and I think we got one more. You can just really see them now. All right, so back to the picture. The attack was successful. It was very successful. And the man who led the attack, his name was Fuchida. He led the first attack. And he was quite successful. They only lost 9 airplanes. The second attack went in, they lost 20. He had a disagreement with Naguma because he wanted to go back. He thought that we had left a lot to be destroyed. Big thing is, see those tanks? They were not touched. They were full of fuel oil. And some of the other repair facilities around were not touched. Later on, he is successful in the war, lives it, and becomes a Christian, tours the United States, and is a minister. Yes, sir?
So you said that this guy led the attack. Do you mean led as in he was in charge of the fleet, or led as in he led the planes into the harbor?
He led the planes into the harbor. Naguma led what they call the Kido Butai, which is the way of the Japanese referring, where we call, the Japanese refer to their things as a mobile task force. So in Japanese, Kido Butai.
And I heard that the main Japanese goal was aircraft carriers to dwindle down the American Naval Air Force that could potentially and did stop the Japanese. Were there any carriers?
There were no carriers there. And let me show you something, because you brought up something that a lot of people talk about. I can see you've been doing reading, and there were a lot of conspiracy theories that the Americans had purposely, they knew that we were coming because we didn't have the carriers in spot. So let me show you why. Something, because I want to make a point about that. I'm glad you brought it up. You've been reading. Okay, here's where the Lexington was at that time. It had gone out to deliver airplanes at Wake Island. Meanwhile, the Chuck, what was the other one? Enterprise. It had done a maneuver here. One of our other docents on the ship told us that her father was on the Hampton. And they wanted to get back to Pearl in time for a big celebration that was going to occur. And they had to be back before Saturday. They didn't get back because somebody screwed it up and got a cable wrapped around the screw, and they were delayed getting back, or the carrier would have been in Pearl Harbor. So we can get rid of that baloney.
What about the other two, at that time, working carriers? The first USS Hornet that launched the delivery after the attack, and the Yorktown.
The Hornet wasn't finished. It was still on the East Coast. So there was only the two in Pearl. So let's go ahead and let's move ahead and catch up with where we were at. At the completion of the first wave, this is a picture of the lieutenant commander. He sent the message, the famous one that we all know about, this in his flight suit, Tora, 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 tiger, tiger, tiger. And that was the word that they had agreed on that would tell everybody that the raid was a success. They had surprised us. Here's a picture, one of the many pictures, classic picture of the ships there in Pearl Harbor. Look up here, you can see 2 men above the bridge here, caught trying to get down. Casualties on December 7th, there were 2,403. 2,403. That's both civilian and military. Well, what was it like in Washington, D.C. at that time? It was a sunny, breezy day. The Redskins were playing the Eagles. And the Washington Redskins had a record of 5-5. They were playing the Phillies, who had a 2-7-1. not a very good record, and the Eagles almost beat them. But Washington Redskins pulled ahead by one and were able to advance. The people, they had made an announcement during the game for the officers to report to their offices. But they didn't tell the people on the in the stands what was going on. They thought that that wouldn't be wise. They left them alone. Roosevelt himself, he had just had lunch at 1:30, and he was relaxing with his friend Harry Hopkins, looking at his stamp collection. He was quite the man for collecting. Meantime, to answer your question, Secretary Hall, along with two of the negotiating people from the Japanese embassy, Nomura and Kuruso, were negotiating. They didn't know that we had already intercepted their messages and knew what they were going to tell us. And that is the coded message right there that came across. The Army intelligence broke it down. We knew what they were going to tell us, that they were breaking off negotiations. There was nothing to be done. At the time, militarily, the Pentagon was under construction. It was right across the harbor. Interesting thing for me, see that runway? It was an airport. And one of the pilots I flew with United Airlines, his father owned it. And he had sold it to the government so the Pentagon could be built. At the time, though, that's the mall. This is where the military was housed, in these buildings right here. This particular building was for the Navy. And this is a street scene of that. You can see right up there, it says Navy Department. So somewhere in one of those offices, this message came across the net. It says, if you can't read it very clear, it says, air raid on Pearl Harbor, break. This is no drill. When it came across from the command SINPAC out in Pearl Harbor.
Started at Kodiak, Alaska.
That was because it went everywhere. This is one of the signals that they remembered. I'm going to read something too because I think it's better to read what happened. At 1:47 p.m., Hopkins was lounging on a couch and FDR was working with his stamp collection when the phone rang on the president's desk. Navy Secretary Fox was on the other line with startling news. Japanese were bombing Pearl Harbor. No, shouted Roosevelt. Hopkins thought it was a mistake, but FDR disagreed. This was the kind of unexpected thing the Japanese would do, he said. Minutes later, General George C. Marshall called and reported attacks on Hawaii's military fields. Only a few office staff were at the White House, but calls quickly went out for personnel to report to work. Meanwhile, FDR and Hopkins worked the phone. Roosevelt called the Secretary of War, the Secretary of State to inform them of the attack. He reached Press Secretary Steve Early at his home and dictated a press statement. And he summoned the military leaders for a 3 p.m. conference. When he called Steve Early, he said, get a piece of paper down. I want you to take this down verbatim. And Steve Early says, this must be a joke. He said, it isn't a joke. And he read the statement that he wanted to have go out to the public. And this is the statement that went out from the White House. It's hard to read, but Roosevelt was trying to control information at that point. He didn't want to go crazy. Any leader would want to do that with such a critical thing. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor from the air and all naval and military activities on the island of Oahu, the principal American base in Hawaii, the Hawaiian Islands. A second attack is reported. This one has been made on Army and Navy bases in Manila. Oh, no, this one has made on Army and Navy bases in Manila. And then you show who it was sent to. New York Times, Herald Tribune, New York Daily News, New York Journal of Commerce, British Service, Baltimore, Chicago Tribune, Washington Post, so on. Interesting thing, Knox, by the way, Fred, yes?
So, December 7th, 1941, we remember as the day that the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. But then I listened to FDR's speech, and I looked at some records, and it said there were also other Japanese attacks on American territories. Why aren't those as famous as Pearl Harbor?
Well, they were. But like a lot of things, sometimes the press likes to talk about certain areas. We'll cover that in a minute. Okay, so this went out to everybody. One of the other things that starts to happen right away, Roosevelt, besides putting that out with Steve early, he calls in his secretary, who's, always forget her name. Somebody said it back there, Grace Tully. And one of the first things he wants to do is he knows he wants to deliver a message to Congress. He had already thought about that anyway, about the war. And so they sit down and start to draft his famous speech we call the Day of Infamy. Here's a draft, here's a copy of the first draft. It was 3 pages long. And you can see there's a lot of crossouts and different things. Interesting thing, we know there were at least 3 drafts. They think there may have been even more. We don't know. But one of the things is, because there were no teleprompters, when he delivers the speech, he has a special version of the speech typed out with 3 triple spaced. That copy is lost. His son picked it up, took it back to the White House, and they never found it. They're looking for it. No one has it.
The Japanese got it.
Japanese. When you look at the log, the usher's log for the day, you can see how it gets very crowded. You can see initially up here it says Japanese ambassador at 12:30, lunch in the study with Harry Hopkins. Let me tell you what he says lunch. FDR rarely spent time in the Oval Office. He was bound to a wheelchair or braces, and he didn't like to impose on the Secret Service to take him down. So he had a little study, which was really like a foyer right off the living quarters up on the 2nd floor. And that's where he did most of his meetings and where most everybody will show up during the day. You can see then the ushers, White House usher at 3 o'clock. Look how crowded it is. They had to even sneak things in between. All the heads of the military services show up. In which, by the way, the military at the time was organized in a real screwy way. There was no Secretary of Army. There was just a Secretary of the Navy and Secretary of War. The Army reported to the Secretary of War. And the Air Force reported to the Army, which reported to the Secretary. It was crazy. And when the British showed up, they looked at it and they go, and they do show up pretty soon. And they pretty well cleaned it up. And it was mostly led by a Navy Admiral Leahy, who becomes Chief of Staff. We were really boondocks. We were the 17th largest army at the time, military, behind Portugal. That's how bad it was. It was really pretty crazy. On that very same day, in answer to your question, this is also what happened besides Pearl Harbor. The Philippines were hit. Guam was hit. Wake was hit. Malaya was hit. Singapore was hit. Hong Kong was hit. All in 24-hour period. The Japanese just went whoom. It pretty much is in this area of the world, inside of that red circle. That's what it went like. This is the headlines on the 8th after the attack. It's the Philadelphia Evening Bulletin, and it reports all that had gone place. They finally got the speech together, and Roosevelt delivered it. He signed the resolution the same day. And there was one person who did not vote for the resolution. Her name was Jeanette Rankin. She was a representative from Montana. I think if someone tried to do that in Montana today, they'd be hung from a tree. But she was a pacifist, and she stood by her position. The first woman to be elected to Congress. Here is the typical poster that we would see thereafter, and became quite common. We were always seeing things out as young people, how important, don't forget Pearl Harbor. I had a chance to spend 2 days with a man named Alex Viraggio. You on the ship probably know who he is. He was one of the big Navy aces. He's a man who you see at the Battle of the Philippines Sea famously with his hand like that, where he had shot down 6 airplanes in less than 6 minutes. This is in 1997, many years after the war. He was still mad at the Japanese because they didn't apologize. They tried to come and interview him. He wouldn't unless they would apologize to him personally. He's buried, by the way, here in Lafayette Cemetery. Interesting man. So there's an epilogue to this whole event of December 7th. Churchill. Where was he when he heard about it? He was at Checkers having lunch when he heard about it with Gilbert Windon and Averell Harriman, who was a special envoy from President Roosevelt. He was excited. He thought, boy, that's it. Here we go. He got on the phone, called Roosevelt, and he wanted to have a meeting right away. And Roosevelt said, no, wait, slow down. You know, we got some things going here. No, we got to meet. I'll meet you anywhere. He basically invited himself because Roosevelt wouldn't go anywhere, and he then decides to come to the White House. He arrives just before Christmas Eve, on about December the 23rd. He lands with his ship at Norfolk. And a very emotional Christmas Eve. There are pictures of him. They light the Christmas tree from the back of the White House. And he becomes a resident in the White House along with Harry Hopkins, who also lives there most of the year. He's excited. He thinks this is great. Now, the United States is at war at Japan, but not quite where Churchill wants him. He wants him over in Europe. The interesting thing is Hitler. And Hitler was in his wolf's lair, and there had been nothing but bad news at the time because the Russians had stopped him pretty much. This is right when they're getting into the cold part of the war that he had started earlier in June. Otto Dietrich, Hitler's press secretary, came in, gave the press piece to Hitler. Hitler was expecting bad news, and Hitler's comment was, "Is this true?" He confirmed it, and in the words of one of the English authors, he says, "Without cap, hat, Hitler dashed out of his bunker 100 meters to the OK headquarters to announce the news. Wilhelm Keitel remembered that was the only time Hitler, during the entire war, ever did something like that. He agreed he was ecstatic. I had the impression," Keitel recalled, "that he felt as if freed from a heavy load, because he thought now the United States was going to be busy over there, was no longer going to be supplying the need that the British had for material." Another part to this epilogue, the Arizona. Let's talk about that because it's such a memorial when you get to Hawaii. This is the way it looked on the day it was commissioned. Coming out of the Brooklyn Yards down the East River. You can see the Brooklyn Bridge right behind it. If you can look at it, you can see it has a very funny looking mass. Not like you would expect to see. But what happens is they do a modernization, and you can see the mass changes dramatically. We're looking at the quarter stern, the starboard side here, bow forward, and that's a stern. One of the things I want to mention, because Dale brought it up, I thought he was reading my script. that beacon he was talking about on Mount Diablo was put out. Tonight you will see it. It was relit about 5 or 6 years ago. It's a big thing in our family because my son-in-law's uncle was part of the project to start it again. It was lit initially by Lindbergh back in the 20s. It was a lighting system pilots used at night to fly from point A to point B at night across the nation. And so don't forget, if you can see Mount Diablo anywhere, look for it. And it's a double light, as I remember, something like that. Also, another thing that Dale brought up, which is important to me as well, this exhibit we have at the back of the ship, the 442nd, I encourage you to go see it, because this is one of the days when the docents are there to talk about it. I went to school with the kids who were in those camps. I was raised, as you know already, I think I told you, I was in Arizona when the war broke out. So after the war, we moved to California. And now I'm going to school where most of those kids came back after being in the camps. And I didn't understand. I said, oh yeah, I said, where'd you grow up? In the camps. I didn't know what the camps meant. It took me time to understand. These kids had lived in those camps, and it was amazing. They were usually the best kids in school. They were great in every way. Takai, the guy in Star Wars, or Star Trek, whatever was that show? Yeah, George Takai. He and I were in the same school district. He was on the other side of town. But we're both the same age. And he's just an example of one of the people. I remember while flying, just the end of my career at United, at that time I was deep in doing some research on a different subject. I'd happened to come across in the files, interesting thing, where all of the Japanese in Hawaii were identified. Herbert Hoover and the FBI, you could tell, it was different stationery. They knew their phone numbers, address, their professions, and all. They were ready to grab them. And the date, 1939. This is 2 years before Pearl Harbor. Of course, they never take them, but Hoover had already identified where all the Japanese were. That's how involved he was in all of this.
Why didn't they end up in camps? The Japanese who were in Hawaii?
Some did, some, not many, but they were denied certain things. Like some of them were already members in the ROTC programs, they were cut off. Some were in the National Guard, they were cut off. And it hurt him. But mostly it was the people on the West Coast. For whatever reason, we thought that we were going to be in trouble here.
I thought I'd heard for Hawaii that it would have affected the economy so much.
Well, also they worked in the shipyards. We needed them.
That's my point.
Yeah. It was a very crazy thing. Why didn't they do the same thing up in your area for the Germans? Because there were German-speaking communities, including German papers, all through the war. And I know people in this community here in the Bay Area where they had, if they went to listen to or learn Italian up there in North Beach, they had to listen to Mussolini's speeches. So that was really a very focused, not fair thing that went out. But why? Maybe because Japanese, easier to identify than Italians or Germans. Kind of gets back to a line that I liked from South Pacific, which I really enjoyed. You have to be taught to be hate. You have to be taught to hate. And sometimes it's easier to hate people that you can see easily than those that you can't.
I understand that a lot of the Chinese Americans actually had signs on them saying, "I am Chinese."
Yes, they did.
They did.
My mother went to Berkeley High at the time, and the Chinese kids did that. They had patches on their shirts and jackets with the Stars and Stripes and Dr. Sun's flag crossed saying, "I'm Chinese."
True. And I too remember the end of World War II. I can tell you exactly where I was standing because now I'm much older. I remember when Pearl Harbor, I was standing in our family's dining room. Didn't go to church that day. But I remember very specifically, it was August, hot, Tucson, and my mother liked to take a nap in the afternoon. She said, "Stay in the yard." Of course, that meant nothing to me. was 8 years old, almost going on. So I had to be almost 9. Of course, I took off. I was up to a place in Tucson called 5 Points because there was a store up there. And as I approached it, the sirens went off. What was going on? And people started running around crying, "The war's over, the war's over." And it was exciting. Because I know my mother, like me, said, "My brother's coming home." And on my part, I thought my brother won the war. Of course, he was a little part of it, but he did win the war. When he finally was released from the Navy, he came to Phoenix and he called Mom and he said, "I'm coming home." And he told her about what time that would be. And of course, my younger sister and I were passing. What's going on? What's going on? Mom said, "Just go out and wait for him. Go out in the front yard." And I remember the postman coming down and other people like saying, "My brother, he won the war. He's coming home." I don't know why I get so emotional about this, but I remember him coming around the corner. It was like a Frank Capra movie with a sea bag on his shoulder, white hat, the Dixie cup cocked at an angle coming down the street. My brother won the war. You couldn't convince me he hadn't. There it goes.